Vi har nu kommit till punkten Bennet-professur och man kan säga en installationsföreläsning av vår Bennet-professor. Det är så att Carl Bennet har donerat medel till Högskolan i Halmstad för att bygga upp strategiskt viktiga områden. Och de här medlen kan användas dels till fast anställda professorer eller man kan använda till gästprofessorer just i en uppbyggnadsfas. Och vi har valt som första Bennet-professor, I will do this in English just shortly, Misha, som första Bennet-professor att bjuda in Misha Pavel som kommer att vara här i 3 år och bygga upp hälsoinnovationsområdet. Jag kommer ge en presentation av honom på engelska. So, we have now come to the talk by our Bennet professor. I just said that Carl Bennet, who is one of the major industrialists in Sweden, he has donated money to the university for building up strategically important areas as funding for professors. And this can be to employed professors here, meaning that they're full-time professors here, or it can be for visiting professors for building up certain important areas. And we decided that the first Bennet professor here will be Professor Misha Pavel. And Misha Pavel is a professor, and you have such a long CV, I just have to read this. Misha Pavel is a professor of practice, jointly appointed between College of Computer and Information Sciences and the Bouvet College of Health and Science at Northeastern University in Boston. He came from a position as a program director of Smart and Connected Health for the National Science Foundation. Previously, he served as chair of the Department of Biomedical Engineering and as director of the Point of Care Laboratory, and he has previously been employed at New York University and Stanford University. You will talk to us about model-based approaches to behavioral informatics in support of future healthcare. Welcome, Misha.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I always have been enjoying very much coming here. I've been here a number of times before. I'm going to talk a little bit about slightly different perspective on how to transform healthcare than what you usually hear about genomics and molecular engineering. My focus will be on behaviors, and these are the 4 or 5 topics that I'm going to cover. I don't know if I get through all of them, but let's try. First of all, I'd like to tell you a little bit about why I'm very excited to work with Halmstad University. And you can see that even within very, very short time, we have already had a number of activities that have been exciting and actually global, with a number of people here, a number of faculty and colleagues here, ranging from special symposium to special workshops, and looking forward to visit of Ingela, for example, in Boston in the next few weeks. But here is the reason why Halmstad University is so exciting to me. About 1997, Stokes wrote this nice book where he tried to analyze what motivates people in research and discoveries. And this is very important when you think about innovation. There's application inspired, and there is understanding inspired, like basic science. So, for example, Niels Bohr was just basic science. He didn't care about applications at all. Edison, on the other hand, was totally interested in applications. And if people in his lab would try to figure out why certain filament works, he would fire them. Pasteur was the person who actually did both. He solved a very practical problem that the farmers had, and at the same time, he discovered the fundamental underpinning of what makes milk spoil and wine spoil. Now, of course, we have now modern era equivalents. Steve Jobs was up until recently. He didn't care about the science, but very much, very, very good in applications. And however, Google started as very basic science. They tried to analyze the internet, and I still have the papers from those days at Stanford. And of course, there is this last quadrant that no one wants to be at, but Halmstad University is right there. And this is what's so exciting to me. Now, this is just a point that application will be forgotten, like the early Apple applications are forgotten, but the principles of window and interfaces hold on. Also, the emphasis on theory is very important, and I just recently found this actual citation for Leonardo da Vinci, that those who ventured on the practice without first qualifying themselves in theory, it's like a mariner who goes without helm and compass. And if we discover the principles, then we can generalize, and that's very important. And I think we are moving right in that direction. Now, although my background is both psychology and computer science and engineering, most of my life I spent in healthcare. And the reason is that healthcare is going to be one of the key global problems everywhere. And these are costs of increasing healthcare. And of course, US is way ahead of everybody, even though the results at the US are not very good. Sweden's part is one of the sort of in the middle of the pack, but still, it's going to be a huge problem from political, social, and economic points of view. So that's why healthcare is a problem. Now, healthcare is first going to be challenged by changing demographics. The number of older people is growing relative to the younger people, and this is what's called the dependency ratio number. It's a proportion of all retired people or not working people to those working. And we call that actually silver tsunami, because it's going to be worse than any terrorism you could imagine if you don't take care of people like me. The reason is, baby boomers, we don't take no for an answer. We are very self-centered. So how do we change medicine? Well, first of all, it has to be changed from being reactive, episodic, to being proactive, preventive. And I'm going to go fast through this because everybody's probably familiar with these issues. Right now, we spend lots of money bringing people to hospital when they're sick. A lot of cure, a lot of healing can be done at home, and especially the preventive. Now, the important thing is a term called precision medicine, and that's been recently a very popular term of trying to identify specific aspects of a patient that will enable us to really target the therapy to that individual, rather than just try some population-like remedy. I'm not going to spend time on this, but we need to base our diagnosis and therapy on evidence. We have to get electronic health records to be interoperable, and I think Sweden is right there doing a great job on that. And we have to take patients and make them part of the process of healthcare rather than being passive. Now, this is the kind of vision of the proactive precision medicine. The target, the patient is in the center, being able to monitor physiological, cognitive, and activity of the patient, use that to assess, used to assess the state, and then intervene. And intervene in a way, the intervention includes not only the typical clinician that we've been used to, but also self-care, family, caregiver, and again, the future medicine, future healthcare is going to utilize much more the sort of family support and lower cost, lower skilled people than the very expensive way that we are doing it now. And of course, this is all going to depend on technology. So you can see this picture of the future has a lot of technology in it. And I'm going to focus on a specific thing. Now, the reason why this is very exciting to us is that last 15 years, development in technology from sensors to computation, wearable devices. We heard about cyber-physical systems an hour ago. Machine learning and big data analytics are all coming together to enable this kind of vision that we have. Now, as I said, typically, this is focused on medical applications, medical approaches, molecular biology and genomics. But what I'm going to talk about is a new vision that argues that behaviors are at least are more important than the genetic makeup. And here is why. If you look at premature mortality, only 30% of that is due to genes. This is the quadrant we can't do much about. We're born with that. But everything else depends on what you do with your life, okay? And so about 40% or more is due to behaviors. And even in the healthcare, behavior is very important. For example, medication errors are also are aspects of behavior. So behaviors are more important than you would ever think, than the medical community usually thinks. And this is why we are trying to figure out how to deal with behaviors, how to understand behaviors, and how to incorporate it into care. And this is just an illustration of our future vision, where a person, even a very young person who doesn't necessarily need immediate care, but it is when you are 20s, 30s, 40s, that what you do is actually affecting what's going to happen to you when you're 70, 80, and 90. The vision is that we have mobile technology that enables us to take all the sensing, combine it with environmental sensors, sends it to the back-end office where analysis and big data analysis are performed. Of course, you have to have cloud computing. Without that, we couldn't deal anymore. And then use it for intervention. And the intervention can involve everything from actually therapeutic to training, coaching, and social support. Turns out social support is very, very critical. Again, Sweden is probably quite good in that domain. Now, this led us to coin this new term, behavior informatics, which is concerned with behavior monitoring, assessment, inference, and intervention based on systems theory. And this is to differentiate it from traditional psychology that likes to take people out of their normal environment, put them in a lab, and then do studies, and very good studies, and model those results. But those results often don't generalize to real life. And we need something that's robust to generalize to real life. To make an important point, this idea of behavioral informatics is not just for this changing behaviors or helping people behave better in terms of eating and so on, but also, as you will see, for physiological measurements, epidemiology, and even for human-machine interfaces and interactive robots. If you want to build a robot that interacts with humans, that robot better figure out what the human is intending to do. Otherwise, you can get into real trouble. And these are some examples of robot learning from watching a person putting shoes on older people. And this one is actually using robots in social situations, which is kind of more surprising and requires deeper artificial intelligence. Here, I'm going to go quickly through a couple of examples, arguing that understanding behavior is also important if you just want to measure vital signs in clinical setting outside of hospitals. What you're interested is heart function, cognition, lung function, and so on, whole long list. But you can't measure those directly, right? Well, those aspects influence variety of variables that are part of the physiological system. However, you can't measure those either, right? All you can measure are forces, pressures, voltages, and so on. So this is what we measure. This is what's observable. From that, this is also influenced by noise, right? So this is what we are observing right now. From that, we need to infer the gold standard clinical indicators, and from those, we try to figure out what this patient's state is. However, as it turns out that these measurements are also affected by the context and behavior. And because of that, in order to make that inference back from these measurements to the patient's state, we need to understand the effects of the context and behaviors. And so even for such measurements, you need to do this. And let me give you an example. If you measure blood pressure, by the way, no one is really interested in blood pressure. The only reason why we measure it is that it tells us something about the cardiovascular system. Otherwise, we wouldn't really care about blood pressure. And we don't have sensing. We don't know. You don't feel when you have high or low blood pressure. But blood pressure measurement is actually affected by activity. When I am late for my appointment and they take my blood pressure, it's like very high, but it's not really bad because I just ran up the 5 floors of stairs to make my appointment. Which arm makes difference? 6% difference. Stress level, breathing, and even ambient temperature, not speaking about alcohol. In order to interpret measurements, you need to actually know what the behavior aspects, what the behavioral context is, even for blood pressure. And here is an example of how, even under conditions that you kind of control it, the day-to-day variability is fairly high. This is one person measured for about 3/4 of a year, and systolic, diastolic pressure as a function of time. And you can see variability. Each point is average of 3 measurements. Now, but here are the actual variance of those 3 measurements. So even if you measure within like few minutes apart, the blood pressure varies. And to understand that, we have to model this. And this is the point I'm trying to prove. When you sleeping is very important, and it affects everything you imaginable about your life, from physical cardiovascular system to cognition. And usually we measure sleep with polysomnography. We take somebody to a lab and hook them up and tell them to sleep normally. Well, there are other ways to do that. What we have done in our lab, and there are several other things, and there are folks here doing it as well. We put load cells under the bed and measured the forces on those bedposts. And what turns out that when a person is breathing, the forces are shifting the inertial center, and as a result of that, we can actually measure things like breathing. And this is one example. And you can see that when we compare the load cell measurement to that of the measurements made by the laboratory, we get very, very close. And here I just want to point your attention to the fact that motion in the bed, which is not detected by the polysomnography, actually affects the measurements that are done by sensors. Here is an example of ECG, which I'm going to skip, but here is one example that I'd like to spend a few seconds on. This is ventricular tachycardia. This is accelerated activity on ventricular activity, and that's a fairly dangerous situation. Here is a healthy patient, but with changing pulse. And what you can see is that if you look at just this part of the record, it would look like tachycardia. And here is even better example, right? Somebody's brushing their teeth, and you would call ambulance if you monitor this. It would be bad if you call ambulance every time when you're brushing your teeth. Now, we all know what good behaviors are, but they're hard, right? So how do we deal with this kind of situation? Well, we could put a big sign here. No, bacon is bad for you. That doesn't do it quite right. We could have some smart applications, and we're doing that. A lot of research on that. The question is, how do you best intervene? What is the best way of using technology to help people? Because what happens, happens to me, right? So I'm working on the talk, on the presentation here, and my wife put some French fries, and I am just eating them without even knowing that I'm doing it, right? And then when I'm finished, I say, oh, I didn't mean to eat those French fries. I didn't even enjoy them. The intervention is as complicated as we call it precision intervention, as a intervention that requires that's needed for a precision landing system. And aeroplane has only 2 million parts. You know, the human brain is more like 10 to the 13th. So we need more complicated approaches than we have been using. And here is a system theoretic approach to intervention. This is the future coach, and actually maybe not so future. Like my colleague Holly Jimison has already put together a system that sort of does a little bit of this. And the idea is that we have input, behavioral model, and output, sampling, and then intervention that's generated ideally by looking at the behavioral model, just like if we were designing for an airplane instrument landing system that would optimize landing. We have to have the same approach for humans, but it's much harder because humans are much more difficult to figure out. But this is what we are trying to do here. Okay, that's our approach to intervention. Here is an example of this vision. This is a study by Bonnie Spring and her colleagues, where she had a number of subjects, I think about 100 subjects, intervened for 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks or 3 weeks. This is an intervention. And here is their weight. The subjects that were given just the standard intervention, that is coaching, lost a little bit of weight and then promptly gained it back. These subjects were given sort of a mobile device. It wasn't quite a smartphone, but it was an initial mobile device. They had to record their consumption and they weighed themselves and so on. And you can see that the intervention worked well, but the biggest problem is to maintain. And maintenance of behaviors is probably the most difficult ones. I think it was Mark Twain who said, quitting smoking was easy. He did it hundreds of times. So here, in order to understand how to maintain, what to do in this region, we need to model the behavior. And this is a very simple model. I don't have time to go through the details. But once you have a model that can characterize the behavior, then you can develop intervention that actually optimizes the maintenance as well as the intervention during the actual period of losing weight. And this is the vision, and this is our approach. And to do this requires fairly complicated understanding and inference of the system that we are trying to affect. Most of our work, and this is mostly work with Harley Jimison, who is also here in the audience, and visiting professor in Halmstad, we have focused on elders because of that issue that I mentioned early on. We have monitored people passively, about 400 subjects, for about 4 years in their homes with very simple devices. These are just detectors of motion detectors, and we monitor the interaction with computers. It's interesting. If you give elder people motivation to use computers, they will. And usually the motivation is like you can communicate, you can Skype with your grandchildren or that kind of stuff. Again, I'm not going to go through the details, but here is just to give you a glimpse of what we can do with these kind of data. This is these are data from one person observed for 1 year. Each circle is 1 day. The dots are firings of those detectors that I showed you. So when they are in a bedroom, it's green. When they're bathroom, it's sort of red, purple. Front door is black. You can see, so this is midnight. This is noon. This part, this quadrant, is night. So you can see that this person slept the first half a year. They slept quite well, not many interruptions. But then they had to go, they were interrupted quite a bit. So something happened there. Being able to see that happening enables us to interfere and interact with the person and perhaps help them. You can see that this person in the morning would make breakfast in the kitchen, lunch, and dinner, but hardly ever went out. This is a person who who lives in a residential facility. Here, she would go out for breakfast, out for lunch, and out for dinner. Much more socialized, very important factor. So I'm not, of course, we can derive lots more stuff by looking at the model, by building models of what's going on. Here is looking at speed of walking. Speed of walking actually is a very good indicator of cognitive function. It turns out that speed of walking can even predict cognitive decline. This is a speed of walking for a person monitored over 3 years, from 07 to 10. This is velocity distribution for each day. You can see there is a slow decline. And in fact, this person was diagnosed with cognitive impairment, mild cognitive impairment. This person actually is pretty steady, but it has had stroke over here. So we can see that, and we can see the rehabilitation. That way we can intervene in the most optimal way. The final example I want to give is about cognitive function. We can measure cognitive function unobtrusively. Mouse movements, for example, are really good indicators. How well you're doing. So it's kind of interesting. We have developed these games like like concentration. It's not exactly first-person shooter, but older people didn't seem to admit that they would like to play first-person shooters, so we had concentration game. But using this game, we can actually look at memory, the working memory, and the decline of the memory over time. And finally, I'd like to just mention that Holly Jimison has actually developed this coaching platform that incorporates all the modelings, or some of the modeling that we have, that I talked about, sensors, and combines life coach, real life coach, with machine intelligence. So the artificial intelligence system looks at the sensors, looks at the data, and suggests messages that would be appropriate for the client. And then the coach just looks at the message, makes small edits, and sends it to them. And it turns out that combination of occasional calls, occasional live calls, but many messages of that sort works very well. And this, in this case, actually using Kinect camera to help them exercise. Anyway, I had to make this talk very short, but I wanted to give you some overview of the overall approach that we are taking, and it's going to revolutionize the way we do medicine and healthcare in the next 10 years. Behavioral informatics and information about behaviors is going to be a key component of future healthcare. Combining sensors with electronic health records and with genomic molecular biology is going to enable us to optimize intervention and being able to intervene just in time. See, when you get a message from your coach, don't eat French fries when you are jogging, it's not doing anything for you. But if you get that message just before you go to a restaurant and order the French fries, then it may be effective. Thank you. Anyway, and to do this, we need computational models. Thank you.